Welcome to Navigating the Healthcare System with Sean Oser. My name is Jessica, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Also joining us as CWD volunteers are Will as tech support and Liz, our room monitor. If you need any help at any time, please feel free to reach out to one of us. If we need to talk to you, we will do so in the chat. To turn your chat on, you're just going to press the chat button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please make sure as you're coming in that you update your name so it says your name, where you're from, and how you're connected to the diabetes community. You can do this by hovering over your picture and clicking on the 3 dots, then choosing rename. All participants will be muted throughout tonight's presentation, but if you do have a question for our speaker, you can send it to us via the Q&A button, which will also be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and those questions will be answered at the end of the session. You can submit those either with your name or anonymously. You may see poll questions pop up throughout the webinar. If so, please know that your responses will remain anonymous, but we encourage you to answer those. All webinar sessions will be recorded and made available via the CWD website for people who are unable to join us this evening. And at the end of the session, you will see a brief 2-question survey appear. Please complete that on your web browser. Now tonight, our presenter again is Sean Oser, who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes just before starting college, and he also has a daughter who was diagnosed at age 7. He's currently an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and is active in diabetes research. And with that, we will let him take it from here.
Well, thank you so much for having me join you tonight. Thanks to Children with Diabetes for being the beacon of hope and education and support that it has been for me and my family and for so many others like us. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about support and navigating the healthcare system and as we start our journey towards refueling. And I'm gonna share my screen here so we can all look at the same thing and we'll get started. So I am a lot of things in the diabetes universe. I'm a patient, as you heard, I was diagnosed when I was 17 years old. And while we're meeting virtually, I've made my patient space shuttle, my green bracelet here. I'm also a parent to 2 amazing twin daughters who are having extremely strange freshman years in college. One of them was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes well before college in 2nd grade when she was 7. So my parent booster rocket here is my orange bracelet tonight. I'm also a family doctor, and I've taken a big turn in my professional career, but also really my personal mission to do what I feel is really important diabetes research. My wife, Tamara, is my partner in crime. She's also a family doctor, also a researcher, and she's really the glue that holds our family and our work together. And several years ago, we decided to start doing diabetes research that no one else seemed to be doing. And we can talk about a lot of that another time, but tonight we're going to talk about navigating the healthcare system and doing it with diabetes. So fasten your seatbelts. Who knows what this is? Many of you might think this is space junk, especially in keeping with our theme here, this space-themed virtual Friends for Life Spring 2021. But I'm here to tell you that it's actually the solar system. I mean, the healthcare system. No, it really is space junk, but it might feel to you like our healthcare system looks just like this. And the good news is that it actually is navigable. So in these next few minutes, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about how to navigate through this flawlessly. Not everything. I'm still learning myself too, but we'll get a great head start together because I truly believe that I can give you some really useful tips over our time together today so that this will be more approachable and less forbidding. So Tamara and I gave our very first talk at Friends for Life Orlando a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We were talking about how to get the best care for you or for your child. And a lot of that same information still applies as we talk today about how to navigate the healthcare system. So I'll boil it down to a few themes and spend some time on each. First, pay attention to your feelings and take care of yourself. This is advocating for yourself to yourself. Next, I had wanted to talk about the healthcare team and battle strategy, know your enemy, keep your enemies close, but those don't really work because they're not your enemy, they're your teammates, and you have to know who you're dealing with and know how they think. We'll go into that. And next, when things get rough, how do you advocate for yourself or your child to others? And when is it time to leave and go somewhere else? And finally, we'll talk about getting and finding support, which brings us to episode 1. In episode 1, we meet a new disease, but we remember some easily forgotten fundamentals. And this is true. Our life was in chaos. Our world was under attack, and we didn't realize it. And as the Death Star approached and took aim, all we really could do was watch. Our 18-year-old daughters were 7 at the time, and this was just a couple days before the gap-toothed one on the right was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And we really didn't suspect a thing at the time. We didn't know that the Death Star was approaching and taking aim. And truly all we could do was watch helplessly as our world exploded. And truly anything you feel is okay. Most or all of what you feel is also relatively predictable. There are many well-studied and cataloged emotions. Even to some extent, the sequence that you'll experience them in is somewhat predictable. And we went through this too. Tamara took some notes during some of the seemingly endless waiting time in the emergency room. These are the words that she wrote: despair, guilt, isolation. You can read them. And from the perspective that we had at the time, as the world as we knew it was leaving us behind and we were hurtling away into a strange new world, it's hard not to feel isolated or fearful or any of these other emotions, kind of like Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster here hurtling away into space. But you're actually not traveling into empty, vacuous space. It only feels like it. There are resources, there are people, there are helpers out there. You'll meet many of them and you'll need help navigating, but you can't forget to take care of yourself and try not to panic. It is important to address your emotions always. There's evidence that distress and psychosocial health and well-being are linked to diabetes outcomes, which is a bit of a downer, but it's also something that you don't need to settle for and that you can act on. We owe it to ourselves and our children and our partners and each other to try. But it's a very tall order to fill. You don't need to hear it from me, though it can be nice to hear it from a doctor sometimes, that all of the stuff that goes into managing diabetes is really hard. And there is so much of it. I definitely get it. But it's important to know that diabetes is a journey, not a race. There are so many aphorisms like this about diabetes. Slow and steady wins the race. It's a marathon, not a sprint. The tortoise and the hare, you can't boil the ocean. They're all true, though. You can only go one bit at a time. If you try to do it all at once, of course, it's overwhelming. So focus on smaller, obtainable goals. Don't try to boil the ocean. Boil an ounce in a frying pan. If you've never done this, it's actually kind of fun. And it's really not true that a watched pot never boils. You just need to see how fast a little bit of water in a frying pan can boil. And you take that smaller and more attainable step, that smaller goal, you can do this. But you need to take care of yourself and your needs. So, right from the seat back pocket of an airplane, put on your own oxygen mask first. Take care of yourself. And if it applies to you, address and be aware of mental health struggles that you might have or that your child might have. Find the resources and the support that you need, and we'll talk about some of how to do that, and to find resources and support that your child might need, and to be the caregiver for yourself or for your partner or for your child that they need you to be. And coping mechanisms are a great place to start. So language matters. And one thing you can do is reframe the language that you use. You can do this with yourself, you can do it with your family, you can do it with your healthcare team too, but remember, they may not be as interested in the language part as you are, so try not to take offense if they use a term that you don't prefer. They really do care about you or your child, and they don't mean it offensively, or at least give them the benefit of the doubt about it. And as we'll talk about, they're not necessarily the best communicators. And along with coping, humor helps a lot too, keeping it light. So again, reframing the language, like this bolus-worthy comment about dessert that we have here, and developing games. These aren't like family game night, sit around the table and play games kind of things, but guess my blood sugar. And these are, Jessica wanted us to do that for a while. She's done it with her friends. We like to bring some color and lightness and some bling, I guess, and accessorizing with your medical alert ID bracelet or skins on your meter or the bag that you carry your stuff in. And we celebrate diversities because that works for our family. It doesn't work for everyone, but humor, as you can find it and as it works for you, can definitely help. And we found Jess in bed this way one night. She got these Grinch gloves in Orlando at Universal while we were attending a Friends for Life conference. And then one night there she was, fast asleep in the middle of the night, like, you're not getting to my fingertips to check my blood sugar so easily. And the laugh was on us, but she's great with humor. And now that you have some tools for yourself, you're ready to venture out with these new tools into the healthcare galaxy, which brings us to episode 2, and knowing your team, where you meet a new army of defenders. And these are people you never thought you would need, but need them you do. Learn from them you must. Learn about them you must. Learn to work with them you must. But again, this is no small task, and we can turn to history to help ourselves with this. So like I said earlier, these people are your teammates. Not everyone on a team gets along perfectly all the time, and it would be helpful for you, advisable for you to learn how to work with them and to manage your teammates. How to be not only a teammate, but maybe the head coach or the manager too, or the captain of the ship. And now I'm mixing sports and space metaphors. But one key difference here is that you can't guarantee, and you shouldn't assume, that anyone else on the team is quite as interested as you are in the success of the team. There has not been a lot of training in communication or listening in healthcare, but thankfully we're moving away from this trust me, I'm the doctor mindset and more towards teamwork and patient-centered care, moving toward, but we're not always there yet. For diabetes especially, it's crucial that things work as a team and that the doctor listen to you and work with you as a team. With strep throat, maybe not. It's a pretty straightforward diagnosis, a very straightforward treatment, but diabetes involves so much self-management, and the self-management varies from one person to the next, and each patient varies from one to the next. So your input is essential to properly managing you and your life, or your child and your child's life, and to improved health outcomes. But Houston, we definitely have a problem. Until very recently, doctors haven't even been trained to listen. And here's a newsflash, not everyone is an inherently good listener, including many doctors. So there was this landmark study in 1984 that showed that only 23% of the time were people attending an office visit allowed to complete their opening statement of concerns. And flashing forward to the 21st century, should be the 21st century, 2001, 2009, it's still happening. So one way you could try to handle this challenge is to talk very fast, but that's probably not truly practical in all reality. But fortunately, there are efforts now to train doctors to listen, and it's fairly recent. There's a good number of healthcare professionals you may be seeing now that haven't had any significant training in listening, but more and more of our current doctors and our future doctors are getting better at this. But the bottom line is this: make sure that you voice your concerns and that you ask your questions. We'll talk about how best to do that, to create that opportunity if it's not given to you. And when you go to a doctor's appointment, realize that you're bringing your emotions to the office. You don't spend every day there, but they do, and you experience the environment differently than they do. You have more riding on this appointment than they do. But what a lot of people don't realize is that they have baggage too that they're bringing in. It's some different things, right? Their baggage looks different from your baggage, but recognizing this and accounting for it can help you navigate just that much better. That's a barrier, but there are some other potential barriers in the relationship that that you might experience between you and your healthcare team. They may be pressed for time. They may not have a wealth of experience with kids. They may not have a wealth of experience at being an adult or at being a patient or having diabetes. They may make some faulty assumptions, but there are also differing agendas. So what am I talking about? When you come to an appointment, you have an agenda of things that you need to address, and this includes some of the things like those that are listed here. Maybe some others, but you get the idea. And your agenda is super important to you, and it should be important to your healthcare team too, but they have their own agenda too, which is news to a lot of people. And what's also somewhat shocking, at least when you see it demonstrated on screen in print like this, is that these two agendas look nothing like each other, but they're both important. And in an ideal healthcare visit, both agendas will be satisfied. And here's where the magic comes. Their agenda is predictable. You can help them check off all the items on their agenda really quickly. That's important because a lot of the time they'll tackle their agenda first. So if you help them finish their agenda, the rest of the time is for your agenda. And the faster you help them finish their agenda, the more time is left for yours. So here are some suggestions to help get there, get the most out of your visits and to navigate the system as best you can. Preparation. You wouldn't go to a professional appointment with someone else without being prepared and without bringing the necessary information. So always prepare before you see the doctor. If you do these things before the visit, you can get through the doctor's agenda really fast. So things like knowing the names and doses of all of your medications, bringing a list. They may be available in the electronic health record, but those things get so jumbled up and so duplicated and so redundant and so inaccurate so quickly that if you can not spend the visit or much of the visit cleaning that up, then it will just save more time. Have information that you can predict that they're going to want to know. Have it at your fingertips, like when was your last flu shot? When was your COVID vaccine? When was your last eye exam? What's the name and phone number and all that stuff of the pharmacy, so that you're not wasting time fumbling for that. Likewise, your meter, your logbooks, don't fumble for them. Have them at hand. Download your pump or your CGM or both before the visit if you can. Bring any forms that you need and complete your portion ahead of time. So if it's a form that asks for your name and address and a bunch of stuff about you, fill it out, because the staff at the office will be delighted that you did it and that they don't have to do it for you. Bring copies of outside labs, give thought to timing of appointments and knowing when we're more likely to run behind and when we're more likely to be on time. But remember those different agendas from 3 slides ago? You just took care of the doctor's agenda like lickety split. And now the time that's left can be spent on your agenda. And on your agenda are the things that you want or need to know. And since you prepared so well, you should hopefully have time to get to all of them, or at least most of them. Which are the most important? Which are the things that you should be asking the doctor or an educator? Which questions should be better asked of the front desk or the billing office? Be selective. And you want to be prepared to get the most out of the answers to your questions when you ask them. So be prepared to write them down. And often an extra set of eyes and ears is better than one. So think about bringing a friend. And since you're getting your questions answered, make sure that if you don't understand something, you ask for an explanation until you do understand it. Try not to feel embarrassed if you don't get it at first. In healthcare, we often speak what's essentially a different language very often, and we can forget that not everyone speaks that healthcare language that we do. So we can also forget that you're actually the only person who really needs to understand our answer to your question. We may be the experts about the healthcare part, but you're the expert on yourself or your child. So although it may be uncomfortable and it may be out of your comfort zone, stand up for what you believe in. I'll share a quick example. There was a time early in our daughter's journey with diabetes that we felt that an insulin pump would be extremely helpful for her. We had our reasons, and we had them very well laid out after lots of discussion back and forth in our household, as you can imagine. And at the time, she was taking 1 unit of long-acting insulin a day, and she was taking 1/2 unit of mealtime insulin for every meal. And she was prescribed to eat 45 to 60 grams of carbs with each meal, and that seemed perfect. It's amazing on those little tiny doses. She absolutely needed that insulin, but it covered that much food. But she was also 8 and she was growing and she was starving, and she pleaded with us to let her eat more. And the only option, with the very best syringes that were marked at half unit doses, the very best syringes could only let us give her another 1/2 unit. And that would commit her to eating a double meal, another full 45 to 60 grams. But she was only 8. So even though 1 meal wasn't enough, 2 was too much. So we felt that an insulin pump was the only way to give a little more insulin and let her eat more. So we asked the team that she was seeing, and we were told no. We pushed back gently, giving our explanations. We were listened to patiently, hands on lap, a patient smile on their face, until we were done making our case, and then we were told no. We tried again, a little differently, no. So we stood up for what we knew was in our daughter's best interest, and that was not to have a one-way conversation where the listening that appeared to be happening wasn't actually happening. And that's true whether you want to switch from injections to a pump, to get a CGM, to try a new CGM, to try a different medication, or try a different meter, to get school accommodations, or whatever it is that you know that you need. They may say yes, or there may be good reasons that the healthcare team points out that it actually wouldn't be good to pursue. So they may say no, and you may be disappointed, but you can insist on understanding why and not just being told no. And that brings us to episode 3, where the plot takes a turn, as it so often does at this point in any story. Episode 3, Turbulent Skies. You have found inner strength. You take care of yourself and your loved ones. You advocate for your needs with your healthcare team, but sometimes you don't get the response that you feel you need. Your vessel remains vulnerable, and more definitive action may be needed. So at this point in the story, our heroes feel like they're in a hostile environment, that they can't get what they want here, that being here isn't good for their health. So they leave. They hitch a ride in an escape pod in search of less turbulent skies. And that's what we did. We never got to yes on the pump with that team. And although we did get an admission that our argument was a good one, they said, we just don't do that at this stage, or something similarly not patient-centered. So we left. We found a new doctor with a new team. And this wasn't easy to do because we had started even questioning ourselves, and maybe our reasoning wasn't so sound. And we really started to question our own sanity and our own, not saying we didn't quite think we were insane, but we were so much self-doubt entered, and it's so hard to fight back against that. But at the new place, we were ready for battle. We made our same arguments. We waited for the opposition. We heard instead was that makes total sense. I completely agree. Let's do it. And it was like learning that we weren't nuts after all. And it was so refreshing to speak with someone so reasonable. But it can be really hard to know when you should think about doing this. It can be really hard to know how to recognize that something isn't right. But at the very least, you should always expect to be treated with respect, to be listened to be responded to, all the things I was talking about earlier. You may need to train some of the team yourself, especially talking about communication, like we were mentioning before. You may need to manage the different agendas, like I was talking about earlier. But if you aren't getting what you need, you may have some thinking to do and some choices to make. Who else is available? Who could you switch to? How far are you willing to travel? Who is it with the healthcare team that's letting you down? Big systems have big systems. So the person who answered the phone, if that's who you had a bad encounter with, they might never even have been in the office that you go to. And I'd hate for you to leave an otherwise fine situation because of someone who you'll likely never interact with again. But if it's a core member of your team, like the doctor, the nurse that always works with that doctor, that may be another story. But you do have options. You can contact a patient advocate in nearly all larger systems. You can contact the office manager. You can speak with the doctor during your visit. You can send a message through the patient portal. You have many options to advocate for yourself or for your child. Which brings us to episode 4, A New Hope, Finding Support Across the Galaxy. So having put your new skills to such good use, you're mostly intact and in a more comfortable spot, but you need some repairs and definitely some refueling. So now for the warm and fuzzy. There are lots of sessions at Friends for Life about support, and Friends for Life is like the definition of warm and fuzzy. You can learn where to find support in person, online, websites, social media, friends and family, hobbies. You are definitely not alone. But it took me about 20 years with diabetes to realize that the doctor's office is not the place to get absolutely everything. Medical advice? Yes. Prescriptions? Yes. Warm and fuzzy? Maybe not. But, and this is an important but, if you have any concern about depression or about anxiety, it is absolutely the right place to go. Depression and anxiety are medical diagnoses. People with diabetes are at more risk of having these medical diagnoses. And just like diabetes or high blood pressure, since they are medical diagnoses, they can be treated and they should be treated. But it needs a healthcare professional to help navigate this part for sure. For other types of support, there are lots of options. There are some more traditional sources, like various parts of the healthcare team that aren't the doctor maybe, in-person support groups, behavioral health specialists, and there are also somewhat less traditional sources like Children with Diabetes, Friends for Life conferences, and other events, and just getting together with a friend and hanging out. So I met one of my best diabetes friends at events like this one and online. And when we can hang out, we do. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. Scott and I actually developed such closely aligned, closely attuned mental telepathy that after a couple of years, we just started totally coincidentally showing up every day at Friends for Life in exactly the same shirt for days and days in a row. It's so uncanny. There are other non-traditional resources too, and these have actually become more traditional, thankfully. So professional websites like Children with Diabetes website, JDRF, ADA, the ADCES, these are organizations with a lot of well-earned credibility. With so much stuff out there online, it can be really hard to pick a trustworthy source or to know what or who to believe, but you can believe in these. And also becoming more traditional, but I still have it listed as non-traditional, is social media. Many of you probably know a lot about this, more about this than I do. And a lot of people have gotten a crash course, especially in the last year or so with COVID. But the power of social media can be incredible. There are some landmines out there to be sure, but there can also be great support and inspiration, especially if you don't know many other people or any other people with diabetes or a child with diabetes. But there are definitely people out there online who are going through something very similar to what you're going through, and they're out there to listen and to give support. And I have a soft spot in my heart for blogs. It's not limited in blogging. You're not limited to a handful of characters or the general briefness of a Facebook post. Bloggers can put stuff out there and talk for whole paragraphs about things. And then people can chime in with comments. Sometimes the comments are as simple as, I thought I was the only person going through this, or I thought I was the only person thinking this. And I'm so glad to read that someone else is too. Tamara and I have done some research into the power of blogs, the content of blogs, trying to fill the space between the people in the patient community who swear by them and the people in the healthcare community who are afraid of actual patients sharing information with other actual patients. So we looked at safety and the type and the quality of the information shared, and we published it in the journals that healthcare providers read to make them more informed and less afraid. Because people who don't know where to find support or who don't know where to look on the internet or social media or go to conferences, most people still ask their doctors. And we want more doctors to know how to refer people to good sources of information and support, especially when the doctor's office isn't the place to get some of those things. More like a support referral. And we're making some progress, but we have a long way to go still. And hopefully this gives you a head start though, because diabetes can be a great strength. And it can be hard sometimes to look at it that way, but it can certainly be a great strength. And it really helps if you know more about how to navigate it. So we've navigated to the end of the galaxy, or at the healthcare system. We have tools, we have buddies, we can advocate for ourselves, we can advocate for each other. We all live happily ever after. There isn't a happily ever after, but we start here tonight with this tale, and there is so much in store for you to help gain more of these tools, more advocacy, more buddies, more friends for life. There's so much for you to refuel from over these next 2 days. So enjoy it, make the most of it. Thank you for tuning in tonight. And a huge thank you to the sponsors who make Friends for Life events possible. Please visit them in the virtual exhibit hall. And a very special thank you to you for listening tonight. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments, but I'm terrible at monitoring the chat. So I'm here for that though.
Thank you so much. It's what I wish I would have heard when my son was diagnosed. There were so many good tips that are just great. We do have some questions that have come in. The first is, how would you recommend bringing up off-label medications with your doctor, especially if the doctor might not be that supportive of off-label meds? This person said they were thinking of GLP-1s for type 1, etc.
So I think it comes down from my perspective to preparing, like I was talking about, and that might be a little bit of different preparation, right? But that fits right there on your agenda with the questions that you want answered. So whatever it is, whatever the question's about, including off-label medications, we prescribe medications off-label all the time. The labeling is only what the FDA has approved their use for, but doctors are quite commonly we do that, and it may not be someone's comfort with how sort of off-label to go may be variable, but if you have good reasoning and if you can sort of state why you think this might be a good idea, I would be sort of armed with that and just ask them. It's hard sometimes to bring in things like that, or to have the courage, or to get the fortitude to step forward and do it and step out of your comfort zone, but it certainly won't happen if you don't ask. And I would hope that the worst thing that they can do is say no. There may be somewhat worse things, but I think they're relatively improbable. Like, I don't think they're going to put in your chart that you ask for outlandish, crazy things. And if you do, then maybe that's time to have another conversation, but also maybe to think about who might better suit your needs. But I don't think that you're going to have that reception. I think that if you have your reasons and you explore that, you get their opinion and ask. I know maybe not for GLP-1s and things like that, but for for CGMs that were not approved yet in certain age pediatric populations that were only approved for adults, some people would step outside of that age group and do it, and it was a conversation.
Great. So our next question is, how do you suggest developing a relationship with the diabetes medical team in this COVID time? This person says they haven't actually met anyone from the medical team in person because their daughter was diagnosed this past summer. So everything has been through Zoom, all the CGM and pump training and all of that. Well,
that's challenging. It's of course, new diagnosis since last summer is, there's lots of people on here who feel for you, and we've been there. And what a challenging time. I would say that I can't imagine doing that all through Zoom, but there's a lot, I think, that we've learned a lot in the last year about telehealth and about how to provide virtual services. There are studies underway. There are a couple of virtual specialty clinics that exist now and are functioning to provide all care virtually. And it may be that you need some time to carve out, if you can, to just sort of get to know them. One of the advantages I saw as I've gone into sort of telehealth full bore, and everybody's sort of looking forward to when can we just go back to normal. One of the things that I've been looking at is what are opportunities that we have in telehealth that we didn't have before? How can telehealth actually be better? So telehealth can be better at if you have a bigger family and you can't bring them all to an in-person appointment ever, right? You can just have everybody say hi from the background, and or they can see what your actual living environment is like, and what your, if your child has a bedroom that they want to show their favorite stuffed animal, stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily bring to the office. And I think that can actually be a sort of a disarming and different way to establish some rapport. It's been very interesting to me from the healthcare side to see a lot of patients' homes. I sort of picture vague, I don't know why I picture it, but maybe I do. But it's very different to be able to see them at home doing what they do. And it's, so look for the opportunities, the things that are better, or the things that are not available in the other ways. But I know it's not the same, and it's still going to be challenging. But then, but when you actually do meet them in person and see them in 3D, maybe you'll have something else to talk about.
Great. So the next question is, what would you recommend for someone who continues to have issues with their provider, but doesn't have many options for other healthcare providers due to insurance or location?
That can be challenging. All of these things are challenging. Insurance is always a big challenge. I think one of the things is maybe just thinking about how far you can travel if you have the resources to be able to drive. If you have the resources to be able to drive a little bit further, just to find somebody else who might participate with your insurance. There are a couple of these virtual clinics, like I mentioned. So there's, they're more accessible without travel, as long as somebody has really phone or internet access. And again, not to take any of those for granted, but I think we have more ways than we ever had before. And when you think about distance that you're willing to go, realize that this isn't probably a trip that you're going to make very often, right? So most of the time, it feels like diabetes visits, especially with type 1, happen about 4 times a year, right? Every 3 months. And maybe that's okay. Or maybe you want to talk to them about just coming every 3 months. I'm sorry, every 4 months and 3 times a year. Or maybe, especially since we've accumulated so much experience with telehealth in this last year, talk about coming to clinic just once a year and having the other visits done by telehealth in between, which certainly doesn't solve all the issues with access and insurance and availability, but I think we fortunately have at least a little bit more flexibility and options than we've had before.
Okay, our next question is, do you have any tips for explaining how important or influential the diabetes community is to friends and family? Some people think it's weird that this person has diabetes internet friends.
Do I have any tips? Well, I mean, I've personally been struggling to be able to adequately explain that to people who haven't experienced it forever, and I haven't figured out how. And I hear that a lot from attendees to Friends for Life events, whether they're virtual or in person, that you just can't understand it until you've experienced it. But no, I mean, I think the people, the other people, the diabetes online friends, right? They get it by and large, and I hear that too all the time with diabetes people that I know, whether they're, for whatever reason, diabetes is in their family, right? And that it's very different to have to explain the backstory or to try to justify to other people who maybe don't have diabetes in their family or who don't have these same types of resources or support, that they just can't understand until they experience it. But I guess one of the questions to think about is, what is it really that important for them to understand, especially since they kind of can't. And for me, it's often enough to know that you guys do get it, and And usually that's enough for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember way back when the internet was just kind of getting started off, and we used to have like AOL message boards, and people didn't understand it back then. So I think, you know, we've definitely come a long way, but there are going to be some people who just don't get it, and that's okay. Let's see. Are there
an
ways?
Interesting phenomenon. Sorry, I showed the
No.
pictures of Scott and me in the red shirts, and when I was goofing around the virtual backgrounds that I made for Friends for Life last summer, because we couldn't sit in the same room with the same shirts anymore, so we decided to do, movie duo backgrounds. But I'm super close with Scott and a few other really close diabetes friends, and I see them an exceedingly small amount of time actually in real life, even before COVID, right, when we actually used to see people. But somehow, in so many ways, I feel closer to them than other people who I spend tons of time with. And I think, again, it comes down to there's this whole huge part of me and my life and my daughter's life, and that we don't need to explain to each other. We can just like pick up and go.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there ways to help get your insurance to cover the devices that you want?
Yes, to help. Not always successful, but data helps and references help. So if you look at, for example, the American Diabetes Association publishes its standards of healthcare, of medical care and diabetes every year. And they're freely available online at their website. They have, it's incredibly long, but you can find what you're looking for, and their references are helpful. So for example, there's one in particular that says that, and they're numbered, they're codified, right? Like, so I think chapter 7 is about technology. So there's recommendation 7.1 and 7.2 and et cetera. So I think 7.11 is something like people who have been using continuous glucose monitors should be allowed continued access to them across third-party payers, which basically means that if you switch from one insurance company to another insurance company and you've had that device covered before, you should be allowed to continue to use it and hopefully not have to provide all the burden of proof and the letter of medical necessity and all that stuff. And if you can point to that recommendation in the standards, hopefully that will help. There are similar things that will say things like this medication or that device has been shown to be helpful in people with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes or youth with type 1 diabetes, whatever, under which circumstances. And if you can bring that, then that can often be really helpful. So can encouraging your doctor to send that type of information. So they may accept it more readily from the doctor's office, from the healthcare team. But there's no reason that you can't provide those references to the doctor and say, when you're doing the prior authorization or the paperwork, here, give them this.
Absolutely. Let's see, after many years with diabetes, I, like many others, make all of my own changes, maintain a steady and good A1C, and have reached a point of not feeling like I need my doctor. How do I go about having productive visits when they usually feel like, you're doing so great, see you next time?
That's challenging. And sometimes that's, I was kind of there, right? Because I know a fair amount clinically about diabetes also, since I treat it in my patients. Not as much as most endocrinologists, because like I said, I'm family medicine, but I certainly do treat type 1 diabetes. I treat a lot of type 2 diabetes. I treat a lot of everything else, but I certainly, there was a point where, and this was part of my long journey, sort of the 20 years that I mentioned of not knowing where to get the information I was looking for, and realizing that it was actually from peers and online and in person and people like you, that I reached a point where once I figured out where to find that information, I felt like I didn't need the doctor very much anymore, but I did still, right? Because I still needed prescriptions for my medications, and I still needed orders for my supplies, and I still needed the lab work ordered, and I still needed to get that stuff, and anything else that they could help with along the way. Maybe they had some suggestions or some observations about glucose patterns or whatever might be helpful. They might mention the possibility of another medication that I hadn't thought of. It's often hard to think objectively about ourselves, right? And so, but they were sort of less useful, but that might be another opportunity where you can extend to, if they have other team members that might be more productive sources of information, or where you might want to see if they can decrease maybe the frequency of the visits if you're not getting that much out of them, or still they serve the purpose of, right, of someplace to get your flu shot and someplace to get your pneumonia vaccine if you're due for that, and to get the lab orders and all the other things. So to get your feet examined, to get your cholesterol checked, all that stuff. But it's certainly a challenge, and I don't have all the answers to that.
So this next question I really relate to as someone who has a child who just turned 13. That's my type 1. So this question is, as a parent, was there a moment when you knew that your daughter was ready to take more control of her own doctor's appointments? How can I help my own child prepare to go from me being in charge to them?
I have broadly 2 answers. Number one is that my wife is much better at knowing that than I am. She's a much more intuitive parent, and I trust her completely, but I learned a lot from her along the way. And one of the most important things that I learned from her is answer number 2, which is ask your daughter. Ask her how involved she wants to be. Ask her how much control she'd like to have, or how much input she'd like to have. And then I think the other thing is I mean, you know your daughter better than anyone else does. But if you don't feel like it would be too much to push her a little bit, just to give her a small, like you do with any parenting thing, right? To give her something small, new thing to take on and to own, with you there to guide, right? And to be there for help if needed. But to see how that goes, because I'm pretty sure that's one of the biggest things that was motivating my wife, and I was totally clueless to. I would have not prepared for this, and I did not have as broad vision as she has always had, to see that someday she's going to be doing this on her own, and we do need to help prepare her. I think that's one of the most important jobs we have as parents, not just for diabetes, but for all of life, right? So, but I ask her, and try to think of it. We tend to we attach these emotional things to diabetes events, decisions, and even if an event is my last blood sugar check, and right, there's my God, my blood sugar was 380, and the oh my God part's really maybe not necessary, and neither is the how did that happen, right? It's just, okay, it's 380. What happens when it's 380? Take insulin, and then recheck it later. And we attach all this emotion sometimes, but if you try, it's not easy to do, but try to look at this question of how do I give her some of the ownership and some of the engagement in driving the healthcare visits. Try to de-emotionalize it a little bit and just make it very concrete, and just give her a task or 2 and see how that goes.
Great. Let's see, how can I find a doctor who understands real life like you do? My doc just looks at logbooks and asks me why I'm not controlled. The guilt and lack of understanding is intense.
Keep looking, I think, is one answer. Or if there's a way to reframe the question, or even reverse the question, and I don't have a good example of how to do that, but it's something that I'm not sure it ever goes away. I was talking to my daughter the other day. Hopefully she won't mind if I share this, but she was showing me her summary statistics from her CGM, and there's been this international consensus about CGM based standards and things like that, and how much time what the target is for spending time in range between 70 and 180, how much time you spend below 70, how much time you spend below 55, what the average hopefully target should be under 7 for the glucose management indicator, like with A1C, and then variability. And so she was meeting the target of all of those. Like, wow, she's meeting every glycemic target except for the one of time below 55, below 70 rather, the target is for that to be less than 5%, and hers was 5%. So if it had been any lower, she would have been at target. So she had just a teeny tiny bit more than desired lows, not more than acceptable, just more than what the target is, right? Everything else was there. And she's concerned based on experience, and based on experiences just like this one that you described, that she's going to go to her appointment and they're going to say, what happened here 3 Thursdays ago? What, you know, and hopefully the answer could be, look at this. I'm working so hard. I'm trying so hard, and I'm achieving targets so much of the time. And even if you're not achieving all those targets, because most people don't, most people struggle. It's a constant struggle, as you know. But I don't know what happened 3 Thursdays ago. But let's look at the big picture, and how can you give me some concrete? Because it's ultimately not helpful usually to me to say, oh, well, 3 Thursdays ago, I went to a birthday party and I had 2 slices of cake. And what's the answer to that? Don't eat 2 slices of cake? That's not as helpful, right? So again, I don't know the best way to do this, but to say, and that's part of the reframing, I guess, is to say, look, let's look at patterns instead of that spot. Let's look at how can we improve my overall patterns, or where can we problem solve? Because I don't see that as a problem. That was just a one-time thing, and let's focus on bigger picture things. Let's focus on patterns.
Let's see. So this question is about mental health. This person said between COVID and diabetes, they felt like the past year has been much more of a struggle, and they're a little embarrassed to bring this up with their doctor, especially since their doctor has not asked any questions about their mental health. How do they take that first step?
That's a great question. And I would start by saying that you're absolutely not alone. This is a very common experience. There's been lots of increase in mental health struggles and behavioral health issues, in loneliness, in depression and anxiety, with COVID especially. And although your doctor may not have asked about it, they're probably, hopefully, accustomed to dealing with it, and they probably won't be surprised. I understand that you might be embarrassed and uncomfortable about it, and of course it feels like a big step to take, and one that you don't know how to take, but I hope that it's easier to take that step, just knowing that that it may be new for you, but it's not new for the team, and they see this a lot. The other thing that I hope is helpful is what I alluded to earlier, that that having any mental health struggles is I view it as medical, right? It's not that there's something wrong with you or that you're failing in some way, although I know that society can be really good at making it feel that way, and that's just not true. So if you can allow yourself not to blame yourself and not to feel that it's a failing of your own, but to say, you know, just like if you sprained your ankle, you would go and seek help. So you sprained your psyche a little bit, and it's okay to ask for help. There definitely is help available. You're definitely not the only one. You won't be, if you call first thing Monday morning, you probably won't be the first mental health call of the week.
That's definitely a great way to think about it a little differently. Let's see, what have you learned from being a parent of someone with diabetes after having diabetes as well? Has the experience of parenting someone changed the way you manage your own diabetes or the way that you think about it?
It's changed it a ton. So one of the first things I had to learn, and I was stubborn and it took me a while to learn this, was that my diabetes is not her diabetes. And that what works for me isn't just, and I think of it as the way that I do things, doesn't mean that it's the way to do diabetes. It's the way to do my diabetes. It's changed a lot of how I've treated myself, looked at myself, and in some cases what I've allowed or stood up for with, I guess, put up with in some care relationships. I switched doctors after what I thought was a particularly unfeeling series of encounters. And I didn't look back, and that was fine. But I think going through sort of all the learning of her diabetes and how it affects her, you know, one thing I've never been is a 7-year-old girl. And I've also never been a 7-year-old with diabetes. It was not until I was 17, almost 18. So definitely looking at things differently. But she's taught me a ton from observing, but also just herself. If those of you who know her, she's amazing. She's incredibly patient and most of the time, and very giving, and has helped me sometimes to. She's great at sometimes reframing my thinking, and I think, you know, we can often look to our children to do that for us. Sometimes they really shock us, right, with some of their wisdom and the things that they say. And this isn't just now that she's 18. This has been ever since she was a little kid. Her and her sister both. So. But she's made me rethink some of my treatment regimen. She sort of going through the thought process of why a pump would be useful for her is what got me to switch to a pump. And it's been very broadening, I would say. It's also what brought me, it was, you know, for me and my needs, I was fine. I didn't need any help. I didn't need any support. I'm fine. So if not for her, I never would have found Children with Diabetes or Friends for Life. I learned a ton from her.
So this question kind of relates to some of the earlier questions and needing to maybe find a new endo and not having many options. Let's see, this person, their endocrinologist is very concerned that they might have low blood sugars and wants their A1C to be in the high 6s, but they used to be in the 5s and they were fine with that. They would rather be in the 5s, but the doctor is very opposed to this. This person lives in an area with very little population, no other endos, and they're aware that maybe they should find somebody else, but they do need their prescriptions in the meantime. Do you have any advice or suggestions for them?
I do, and I'm not sure if the other, I think only the panelists can probably see the questions, right? But I know who asked this question, and I know this person's age, roughly. And I would tend to say that that hypoglycemia becomes increasingly potentially dangerous, especially as you get older, which is not to scare parents of children with diabetes, but as we get older, even without diabetes, our risk increases for just other things that happen with age, like heart disease, and that increases somewhat more so with diabetes. So we know that there's great data from the DCCT, and since then, and I can show you graphs that I'm not going to show tonight because I know we only have a few minutes left, and that's another story. But that decreasing A1C from 11 to 10 has definite benefits in terms of decreasing risk of certain complications, from 10 to 9, 9 to 8, 8 to 7, and from 7 to 6. There's only a little bit of incremental benefit, which is one of the ways that we've landed at generally most organizations recommending an A1C target of less than 7. But as you go much further below that, like into the 5s, the risk of hypoglycemia does go up significantly. So although you may be uncomfortable being in the 6s compared to the 5s, I think it comes from a good place, a place of caring, and I think it's sound medical advice, but unfortunately there's no one right answer, right? So we're balancing risk of hyperglycemia against risk of hypoglycemia, and at some point though, the risk of hypoglycemia becomes maybe unacceptably higher, and it's somewhat of a value judgment to where that is. That's personally, I don't think that's one of the egregious errors of judgment that would make me look for another doctor. But it can still be a conversation, and I would say talk about it with them. And I'd say the other thing is, if you're using, for example, the CGM, and you can be alerted to hypoglycemia, then maybe you have a little bit more tolerance for that, as opposed to, so much of hypoglycemia is undetected, and it happens in sleep, and it happens more in sleep with people as they get older. But if you have a CGM and it works well for you, and you know that it's reasonably accurate, which most of them are, then maybe you can go a little bit lower, and that's another conversation to have with them. the other thing to do, I think, is to look at CGM data and say, look, I'm in the mid sixes now. I know you want me in the high sixes, but I'm having like 1% time below range and 0% or less than 1% time below 55. And even when I was 5.8, 5.9, I was still having very, very little hypoglycemia. So maybe this doesn't apply to me, and I'd still be more comfortable there. But there's a lot of conversation that can be had.
Perfect. Have you ever had a difficult time being on time for your patients while managing your blood sugars? And if so, are your patients understanding?
I'm very selective about who I share my diabetes with patient-wise, but there definitely are some. Sometimes I see it as, I don't know, if I think it's gonna enhance my ability to care for them or their ability to relate to me and for us to have a better relationship, a physician-patient relationship, then I will. It's not something I usually work on hiding, but there have been a couple times when I'm sure when I delayed seeing a patient because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't low anymore, for example, and that I was sharp and that I wasn't dangerous. Like I wouldn't drive low, which can be dangerous. Why would I give someone medical advice when I'm low? So I'll, usually it's not a matter of excusing myself. There's only been a couple cases, I think, where I became low during a visit, but usually it's more like I can tell I'm headed there, or my CGM tells me that, and I'll take care of it between patients. And I might wait to go in to see a patient. But I run behind for other reasons than that way more often. I usually tend to over-explain. I apologize for that sometimes to patients, and they tell me, no, we like how much you explain and whatever. But and I strive to be more on time, but specifically related to diabetes, not usually. That doesn't usually put me behind.
Okay, just have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
There's someone who's wondering if CGM sensors can be considered a maintenance med, because they can get better prices on those. So they're wondering, is there maybe a medical necessity form or some other form that you're aware of that would make this possible?
So some sensors I know are available as durable medical equipment, and the more traditional way that pump supplies are usually thought of. But I know that Abbott has been pushing really hard to have their Libre sensors distributed through pharmacies under the pharmacy benefit, and Dexcom's been pushing really hard to do that more lately too. It was totally unknown to me that a couple of years ago that I was just used to getting my Dexcom sensors through the durable medical equipment benefit, but I was told then that I could also have an option of getting them through pharmacy. So I don't know particularly as a maintenance medication, but the prescription's written the same way. And through the mail order pharmacy, you might need to find a pharmacy that actually carries them, which isn't all of them, but there are specialty pharmacies that do. And that can certainly be useful for sure, especially since very often the pharmacy benefit doesn't have the deductible that the other side does. That you don't necessarily need to fill your $3,000 deductible like you do with durable medical equipment before they start giving you your discounted rates for filling prescriptions through the pharmacy.
That's super helpful to know. I'm over here taking notes to follow up on that. As technology increases for diabetes care, not all doctors are up to date or comfortable with new devices. Besides being prepared, is there a best way to get them on board with these new devices?
We're still working on that. So a lot of the work that Tamara and I have been doing lately has been to work towards getting CGM more into primary care, for example. So and insulin pumps are another story. I think they're in general harder to determine the rates and the ratios and all that stuff and to support, and most primary care offices aren't as nimble to support them. And but hopefully there are others coming down the pipeline that will be much easier to support pump wise. But CGMs, I think, are the next step. So we have been developing with the American Academy of Family Physicians a CGM module, basically for like full everything, soup to nuts, about how to implement CGM into your practice. So more is coming for doctors. That'll be available next month, I think. The American Academy of Family Physicians is having a big push on CGM education in general. I don't know that the CGM devices are so complicated, but I think one analogy, and I know we're basically out of time, but I'll often use the analogy of a spreadsheet that has tremendous capabilities, or a word processor has tremendous capabilities, and most of us use them, use those products. A word processor, for example, we use a teeny tiny fraction of its real capabilities, and it does what we need. And so CGM, for example, isn't all or nothing, and you may not need to have your doctor be so comfortable that they know how to do absolutely everything with it. But if you go, and I was mentioning some of those new metrics, right? The average glucose, the time above range, the time below range, the time in range, the variability. And if you can just get down those basics, you can see so much more about diabetes management, but you don't have to understand the entire word processor to do it. So bringing it to them, helping to educate them, just like you might have to train them how to communicate sometimes. But if you can train them too about CGM, and you can learn together, then that might be helpful.
Definitely. This last one isn't a question, just a statement that your empathy and compassion are as impressive as your medical knowledge. The medical community, your patients, and your friends are lucky to have you. And we're so thankful that you were able to join us tonight and just give this amazing presentation and great tips for us to take moving forward.
Well, thanks very much. That's very nice to hear. And there's no community that I enjoy giving back to more than this one. So thanks for listening, and thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Amazing. Thank you so much. In the chat, there's a link to the rest of the schedule for the weekend. So if you want to check out what's coming up tomorrow and Sunday, that's where you'll be able to do it. And thank you everyone for coming tonight.